Gavin Newsom walked into the Bakersfield Convention Center with a perfect media-trained smile and a meticulously rehearsed script designed to humiliate J.D. Vance on live television, but he never anticipated that a 67-year-old electrician would be the one to systematically dismantle his political empire in a matter of hours. The atmosphere inside the Bakersfield Convention Center on that fateful evening was a study in stark, unavoidable contrast, humming with the quiet, desperate energy of working-class Americans seeking answers rather than political theater. It was 7:43 p.m., and the hall, a regional gathering space built in 1962 with excellent acoustics and unpretentious sightlines, was three-quarters full. At the front of the stage sat the Vice President of the United States, James David Vance. At 41 years old, he radiated a grounded, almost defiant stillness. There was no grand podium separating him from the audience, nor was there the familiar, glowing pain of a teleprompter dictating his thoughts. He perched casually on a simple wooden stool, dressed with the utilitarian practicality of a man who understood the weight of the room. A navy polo shirt devoid of a tie, worn blue jeans, and scuffed brown leather boots that bore the unmistakable, weathered scars of 4 harsh winters in Cincinnati. Pinned over his left chest was a solitary, understated piece of metal, the eagle, globe, and anchor of the United States Marine Corps, resting close to his heart. In his right hand, he held a single-stage microphone with a relaxed but firm grip, while a plain glass of water sat on a small table beside him. His eyes, sharp and attentive, were locked onto the man standing opposite him in the second row. That man was Robert Marquez, a 67-year-old veteran electrician who had proudly paid his dues to the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 428, for 41 years. Clad in a faded plaid work shirt neatly tucked into rugged Wrangler jeans, Mr. Marquez stood with the quiet dignity of a man who had worked with his hands his entire life. His union hat rested on the empty chair beside him. He had driven 92 long miles from Delano to Bakersfield, having waited patiently on a town hall list for 6 agonizing weeks, just for a fleeting chance to ask the vice president a question about the crushing weight of his electric bill. His voice, thick with frustration but devoid of self-pity, echoed through the quiet hall as he explained that his energy costs had skyrocketed by 43% over the last 3 years, that his hard-earned union pension remained frustratingly flat, and that his beloved grandchildren were packing their lives into boxes and moving to Texas simply because the dream of owning a starter home in California had evaporated into an unaffordable illusion. Looking Vance dead in the eye, Marquez stated with unwavering clarity that he was not seeking empty sympathy. He demanded to know exactly what the federal government was prepared to do about it. Vance leaned forward, his expression serious and engaged, deliberately abandoning the evasive jargon typical of Washington. His voice resonated with steady authority as he addressed Marquez's concerns with granular precision, citing the specific findings of the Southern Methodist University Energy Economic Study, published the previous spring, referencing the intricate details of the Federal Grid Modernization Act currently stalled in conference committee, and methodically exposing the suffocating regulatory hurdles that the California Public Utilities Commission had deliberately imposed on natural gas interconnection. It was precisely at this moment of earnest dialogue that the heavy side door, situated near the loading dock and favored by traveling political operatives, swung open. Through it stepped Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, cutting a figure of calculating, hyper-polished ambition. His physical presentation was a masterclass in manufactured perfection. He was sheathed in an immaculate Brioni navy suit, paired perfectly with a pearl white dress shirt and a specific, scientifically chosen shade of blue tie, a color his Sacramento media consultant had agonizingly selected 3 days prior after rigorously testing 4 alternatives against the warm, unforgiving color temperature of broadcast television lighting. Not a single strand of his hair was out of place. Trailing behind him like a royal court was a phalanx of operatives, 4 anxious staffers, 2 camera operators wielding heavy, handheld professional rigs, and a senior communications aide whose eyes darted furiously as she coordinated directly with CNN's control room in Atlanta, counting down the 90 seconds until their live national cut-in would broadcast this planned ambush to the country. Newsom did not linger in the shadows at the back of the hall. He marched purposefully down the center aisle, his chin tilted at an angle calibrated to project confident authority. As he advanced, the audience turned, a wave of shifting bodies and murmurs rolling through the room. A scattering of polite applause drifted from the back rows. Newsom voters who had registered with the intention of challenging Vance and were pleasantly shocked to see their governor materialize. However, this was sharply undercut by a chorus of audible, weary groans swelling from the front and middle rows, from citizens who recognized an opportunistic disruption when they saw one. Through all of this sudden commotion, Robert Marquez remained planted like an old oak tree. He did not flinch, he did not turn his head to witness the governor's grand entrance, and he kept his gaze intensely fixed on the vice president. Newsom's arrival was the culmination of an obsessively choreographed strategy. He had spent the entire afternoon sequestered in a fourth-floor suite at the Bakersfield Marriott, 3 blocks away, secretly booked under his communications director's name. In that room, crowded with 11 high-level strategists, Newsom had rehearsed this very entrance until his movements were pure muscle memory. He had practiced his opening line, "Forgive the intrusion," perfecting a specific vocal cadence that his media coach insisted would project a sense of reluctant, noble duty rather than raw, aggressive ambition. Most crucially, he had meticulously rehearsed the exact physical distance at which he would halt his march. His team had calculated that stopping too close to Marquez would make the governor appear physically intimidating and dismissive of a constituent, while stopping too far away would make him look aloof and disconnected from the California working class. 5 feet was the mathematically determined sweet spot. He had literally measured it out on the hotel room carpet with a tape measure retrieved from his Sacramento office. In the hours leading up to this exact second, those 11 strategists had brainstormed the vice president's most likely reactions to this sudden confrontation, drafting, cutting, counter responses for the 7 most plausible scenarios. They had built comprehensive messaging for the ensuing news cycle based on 3 anticipated outcomes: Vance accepting an impromptu debate, Vance refusing out of visible defensiveness, or Vance awkwardly attempting to deflect. Yet, despite all their expensive polling, behavioral models, and media training, none of those 11 brilliant political minds had constructed a contingency plan for the 4th outcome, the devastating reality that was about to unfold before their eyes. Newsom reached the front row and stopped flawlessly at his rehearsed 5-foot mark, standing tall in the narrow aisle between the waiting electrician and the seated vice president. His staff immediately fanned out behind him in a tactical formation, the handheld cameras hoisting onto shoulders to capture the anticipated confrontation. On the stage, Vance did not flinch. He did not stand up to match the governor's towering posture, nor did he shift his weight defensively on the stool. He simply let the microphone rest loosely in his right hand, his calm, piercing gaze locked onto Newsom, letting a profound, heavy silence stretch across the room. When Newsom finally spoke, he raised his voice, pitching it not for an intimate conversation with Vance, but projecting it to the back corners of the room, playing directly to the cameras with the theatrical flair of a man fully aware that he is the star of his own broadcast. He offered a performative apology to the vice president for the intrusion, and then, with a patronizing glance toward Marquez, apologized for interrupting his question. But, Newsom loudly declared, his voice dripping with rehearsed indignation, since the vice president was standing on California soil, talking to Californians about California issues. It was high time they had the tough conversation that Vance had allegedly been dodging for 13 long months. Newsom paused perfectly, executing a dramatic beat he had practiced in front of the mirror. His chief of staff, Dana Williamson, had aggressively advised him to never ask for permission, to simply take control of the room, because Vance would never recover from the sheer alpha dominance of the move. Newsom leaned into the attack, his eyes narrowing as he accused the vice president of repeatedly calling him a liar from the safe distances of Washington, Twitter, and Fox News. He took a calculated, aggressive half-step forward, closing the gap, the mechanical whir of the camera lenses adjusting to keep him in sharp focus as he challenged Vance to look him in the eye from mere feet away and repeat those accusations to his face or admit to the nation that he was nothing more than a political theater actor. With a sweeping gesture, Newsom challenged him to debate right there, right then, demanding that the country deserved to witness whether Vance could defend his policies without the protective shield of a podium between them. The convention center plunged into an absolute suffocating quiet. Across the nation, CNN's live broadcast had abruptly cut in, slapping a glaring red breaking news banner across millions of screens that read, "Newsom confronts VP Vance at California Town Hall." Digital analysts would later note that within 4 agonizing minutes, the names of the two men were trending globally on social media. Through this explosive escalation, Vance remained utterly immobilized on his stool, his face an unreadable mask. For 4 excruciating seconds, he executed a maneuver that completely baffled the 17 seasoned political reporters frantically typing in the press section. They were confused because they had never, in their decades of covering Washington egos, witnessed a politician utilize this specific tactic. Vance was completely ignoring Gavin Newsom. Instead, his eyes were locked with a soft, steady empathy onto Robert Marquez. The elderly electrician had been left standing in limbo for 90 uncomfortable seconds, his tired legs holding him upright after driving 92 miles, still desperately clutching onto the hope of an answer about his crushing bills. When the vice president finally broke the silence, his rich baritone voice bypassed the governor entirely, washing gently over the anxious constituent. With profound sincerity, Vance apologized directly to Marquez, his tone softening as he politely asked the older man if he would mind sitting down for just one brief moment, giving him an absolute, unbreakable promise that he would return to his specific question. Marquez, his brow furrowed in a brief moment of hesitation that the unblinking C-SPAN cameras captured with crystal clarity, slowly lowered himself into his chair. Only then did Vance slowly turn his head, his posture shifting as he finally acknowledged the towering governor standing before him. When he spoke, there was no anger in his voice, only a cold, immovable bedrock of principle. He looked up at Newsom and calmly stated that he would be more than happy to have a conversation, but absolutely not in the format of a performative debate, and certainly not at this exact moment. His eyes hardened slightly as he reminded the governor that Mr. Marquez had just asked a deeply personal question about his survival, that he had languished on a waiting list for 6 weeks just for the privilege of holding that microphone, and that he had driven through the night from Delano to be there. Vance's voice dropped an octave, carrying the weight of an unshakable moral absolute, as he declared that the Vice President of the United States owed that working man an answer, long before he owed any politician a televised debate. The silence that followed was not just quiet, it was heavy, pregnant with the sudden shifting of power dynamics. Vance gestured casually with his free hand toward the third row, politely informing the governor that if he wished to sit and wait his turn, there was a vacant folding chair situated next to Carlos Hernandez, a hardworking gentleman who ran a modest almond farm in Shafter. Vance outlined his strict rules of engagement, his tone utterly matter-of-fact. He would gladly address the governor's concerns, but only after he finished answering Marquez, and only after he addressed Mrs. Patel in row 8, and only after he spoke to the man wearing the green shirt in row 12. They would proceed in strict, respectful order. Vance paused, letting the reality of the situation sink into Newsom's meticulously styled head. With a slight shrug, Vance offered the governor an alternative. If his busy schedule could not accommodate waiting behind ordinary citizens, he was completely free to turn around and walk out the door, noting dryly that the cameras would undoubtedly follow him. But, Vance finalized with a voice that rang like struck iron, he absolutely refused to look Robert Marquez in the eye and tell him that the political ambitions of the governor of California superseded the urgency of his electric bill, because where Vance came from and where Marquez came from, that was simply not how the world worked. The Bakersfield Convention Center, a building whose walls had absorbed over a decade of bombastic political rallies, frantic Republican fundraisers, and even a sprawling 90-minute town hall hosted by Newsom himself back in 2019, had never absorbed a moment quite like the devastating, paralyzing silence that rushed in to fill the space after Vance's words. Newsom was suddenly trapped, standing awkwardly in the aisle, the victim of his own ambush. His mind raced through his rapidly evaporating options. If he meekly sat down in row 3 next to the almond farmer, he would be publicly submitting to Vance's framing, humiliatingly accepting the status of an ordinary citizen relegated to the back of the line behind a working-class electrician. If he turned on his heel and stormed out, he surrendered the battlefield entirely, looking weak and cowardly on national television. If he aggressively pressed the demand for a debate, he would be caught on camera, blatantly violating the profound moral protocol Vance had just established, looking like a callous elitist, demanding privilege over a struggling senior citizen. His perfect hair, heavily sprayed to withstand the Central Valley heat, remained perfectly immobilized. But in this terrifying political vacuum, perfect hair offered absolutely no tactical advantage. Driven by instinct and a desperate need to reclaim the narrative, Newsom selected the third option. Thrusting his chin forward, he attempted to hijack the emotional high ground, aggressively insisting that Marquez's electric bill was the precise reason he was demanding this debate. Newsom's voice rose, vibrating with practiced outrage, as he accused the current federal administration's energy policies of systematically crushing the working class of California, dramatically gesturing toward Marquez as he offered Vance a golden opportunity to defend his failed record right in front of the man he was purportedly trying to help. Newsom ended his counterattack with a sharp, rhetorical sneer, demanding to know why the vice president was so terrified to accept the challenge. It was a remarkably fluid recovery, delivered with enough conviction that 2 Democratic senators, nervously watching the muted CNN feed in the luxurious lounge of the Hyatt Hotel near the Sacramento Capitol, quickly texted each other in relief, noting that their governor had managed to stick the landing. But Vance remained completely unfazed. He did not rise to the bait, nor did he elevate his physical presence to match Newsom's looming stature. Remaining firmly seated on his stool, Vance casually replied that he was not afraid of anything. He was simply trying to do his job. He then gently requested that Mr. Marquez stand back up, reminding the room that he still owed the man a complete answer. As the 67-year-old electrician slowly rose to his feet, Vance locked eyes with him, completely shutting Newsom and the hovering camera lenses out of his peripheral vision. Speaking with a rapid-fire fluency that betrayed a deep, internalized grasp of policy, Vance validated Marquez's pain, confirming that his data also showed the brutal reality of that 43% increase. He systematically dismantled the architecture of California's energy crisis, his voice steady and authoritative as he laid out the 3 core reasons for the suffocating rates. First, he targeted the state's grid structure, explicitly designed to heavily subsidize wind and solar generation mandates, fundamentally shifting the massive financial burden onto the backs of working-class ratepayers. Second, he aimed directly at Newsom's own administrative failures, pointing out that the California Public Utilities Commission, a regulatory body entirely appointed by the governor, currently standing in the aisle, had ruthlessly approved 14 separate rate increases over a punished 4-year span. Third, Vance highlighted a devastating statistical anomaly, noting that California stood alone as the only state in the republic to simultaneously jack up retail electricity rates by 43% while experiencing a catastrophic 31% plunge in industrial production during the exact same time frame. He paused, ensuring the numbers settled heavily upon Marquez, who was nodding slowly, absorbing every word. Shifting from diagnosis to aggressive remedy, Vance outlined the federal government's impending interventions. He promised the immediate restoration of federal lease authority for energy production, vowing to unlock 17 million acres of California land currently choked by restrictive mandates. Furthermore, he revealed high-level negotiations regarding a robust federal preemption framework specifically designed for grid interconnection, a legislative hammer that would forcibly override the state-level regulatory blockades preventing nuclear and natural gas generation, emphasizing with a hard edge to his voice that this would happen regardless of whether the governor chose to cooperate or obstruct. Leaning slightly forward, Vance tapped the small metal pin on his chest, his eyes flashing with a fierce protective intensity. His voice resonated through the hall as he reminded the room of his service as a logistics marine in the deserts of Iraq, delivering a devastating final blow by stating that he fundamentally refused to negotiate with politicians who forced his working-class brothers to pay vastly more for basic electricity than citizens living in Mississippi. The response from the room was immediate and visceral. The back rows, where Newsom's hastily assembled pocket of supporters clustered, remained dead silent. But the front rows, surrounding the still-standing Robert Marquez, erupted. The applause was not polite. It was a roaring, sustained wave of validation that crashed over the stage. A seasoned reporter from the Bakersfield, Californian, furiously scribbling in the press section, would document the next morning that the deafening ovation lasted for 41 uninterrupted seconds. Through the noise, Newsom remained frozen in the aisle, his knuckles white as he stubbornly refused to take a seat. As the applause finally receded, Newsom's eyes darkened, and he pivoted to his nuclear option, the specific, deeply personal psychological angle his communications team had been feverishly wargaming for 13 months. This was the exact attack vector they had developed ever since the paperback re-release of Hillbilly Elegy, an angle refined by coastal magazines, and weaponized on Newsom's own podcast and late-night social media tirades, typed out alone in the governor's mansion with the relentless discipline of a man whose presidential ambitions hungrily extended far beyond the borders of California. Newsom's voice cut through the lingering murmurs, dripping with a condescending, practiced sorrow. Pouncing on the mention of the Marine Corps and working-class identity, the governor launched a deeply personal assault, claiming to speak for a nation that had been questioning Vance's authenticity for 7 years. Newsom weaponized the vice president's own autobiography against him, loudly proclaiming that serious scholars and genuine working-class Americans alike viewed Vance's entire persona as a carefully curated performance, a cheap costume worn for political expediency. Newsom aggressively dissected Vance's past, his tone mocking as he narrated a life story of a man who, despite experiencing early hardships, was ultimately raised in a comfortable middle-class Ohio suburb, secured a scholarship to the elite halls of Yale Law School, and currently resided in a sprawling $4 million mansion in Cincinnati, alongside a Yale-educated wife who had prestigiously clerked for the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Newsom paused, his chest heaving slightly, perfectly executing the rhythm of a paragraph he had personally authored and obsessed over. He locked eyes with Vance, his face twisting into a sneer of moral superiority as he accused the vice president of parading around the convention center, pretending to understand the gritty reality of Robert Marquez's life. Newsom spat out the contrast, noting that while Marquez had spent 41 backbreaking years pulling wire and installing conduit, Vance had spent his brief 4 years in the Marines sitting behind a desk as a public affairs journalist, safely insulated from actual combat. He ruthlessly charted Vance's lucrative trajectory, 2 cushy years at a high-powered corporate law firm in Washington, followed by 8 highly profitable years swimming in the opulent waters of venture capital, faithfully serving Peter Thiel, a controversial billionaire who had amassed his unimaginable fortune through invasive surveillance technology. Newsom's voice climaxed in a crescendo of theatrical disgust, pointing an accusatory finger at the stage as he delivered his kill shot, roaring that J.D. Vance was not Robert Marquez, but rather a wealthy, Yale-trained venture capitalist who merely played a folksy hillbilly on television. It was, without question, the most lethal, beautifully articulated attack of Gavin Newsom's entire political career. The devastating phrase "plays a hillbilly on television" was instantly clipped by his rapid response team, soaring onto his personal social media accounts before Vance could even draw a breath to respond, destined to amass 19 million views by sunrise and become the undisputed crown jewel of the Newsom political machine's content for the entirety of 2026. In the second row, a cynical correspondent for The Atlantic, who had built a career writing scathing critiques of Vance's populism, physically stopped typing. It wasn't that he disagreed with Newsom's brutal framing, but his deeply honed journalistic instincts recognized the terrifying architectural reality of political combat. The most devastating, perfectly executed attacks invariably leave the attacker completely exposed to the most catastrophic counterattacks. He held his breath and watched the stage. For the first time all evening, Vance stood up. He did not rush, nor did he look angry. He took 3 slow, deliberate steps forward, the heavy thud of his boots echoing on the hollow wood, and casually sat down on the very front edge of the stage, his legs dangling loosely like a patient schoolteacher addressing a deeply troubled classroom. He gently placed the microphone on the floorboard beside his hip. He completely ignored the towering governor. Instead, his gaze swept across the room, finally resting with profound gentleness on row 8, where a tired woman wearing a rugged CAL FIRE uniform sat closely beside her teenage daughter. Just 20 minutes prior, before the governor's chaotic intrusion, this mother had anxiously asked if her daughter might qualify for a federal scholarship to pursue a degree in fire science. When Vance finally spoke, his unamplified voice was startlingly quiet, yet it carried an emotional density that instantly grounded the entire convention center. He spoke directly to the mother, promising her a careful, honest answer, because both she and Mr. Marquez deserved nothing less. His gaze widened to encompass the unseen thousands watching through the lenses, the union electricians in Sacramento, the exhausted truck drivers navigating Stockton, the sweat-soaked welders in Long Beach, promising them all a response stripped of political artifice. Slowly picking the microphone back up, Vance maintained his low conversational volume, instinctively trusting the building's phenomenal acoustics. Turning his head slightly, he addressed Newsom, his voice devoid of defensiveness. With a brutal, disarming honesty, Vance systematically validated every single weapon Newsom had just hurled at him. He freely admitted to attending Yale. He proudly confirmed his wife's prestigious clerkship. He acknowledged his lucrative tenure working for Peter Thiel. He looked down at his own hands, admitting with a self-deprecating nod that he absolutely did not spend his days enduring the physical toll of installing electrical conduit. He declared that every single fact the governor presented was entirely accurate, and he refused to waste a breath disputing a single syllable of it. But then, the atmosphere in the room palpably shifted. The air grew thick as Vance drew a slow, shuddering breath, his shoulders dropping as he prepared to pull back the curtain on a deeply private pain. He wanted the governor, and more importantly, he wanted Mr. Marquez to understand the foundational truth of his existence. The room held so still it felt as though 2,000 people had simultaneously forgotten how to breathe. Vance's voice trembled slightly, raw and unpolished, as he vividly described his grandmother standing on the grueling assembly line at Armco Steel in Middletown, Ohio, for 33 backbreaking years, while his grandfather labored in the same brutal conditions for 41. He laid bare their ultimate financial reality, revealing that their combined hard-earned pensions paid out less in a year than his brilliant wife now earned in a single month at her family law practice. The silence deepened into something holy and agonizing as Vance shifted the narrative to a freezing October night in 2008. His eyes seemed to look right through the back wall of the convention center, staring into a bleak memory as he recounted his mother's catastrophic admission to a hospital in Hamilton, Ohio, following a devastating heroin overdose. His voice cracked with a mixture of old rage and lingering grief as he explained that the hospital ruthlessly discharged her a mere 11 hours later, shoving her out the door simply because her impending medical bill was going to hit $16,000 and she lacked the insurance to cover it. The crowd listened in, stunned, paralyzed horror as Vance recalled throwing himself into his car in Columbus, a terrified Ohio State undergraduate desperately racing through the darkness to bring his broken mother home. His voice dropped to a near whisper, describing a woman who was 51 years old but had wasted away to a fragile 94 pounds. He stopped speaking. He didn't look at the flashing red lights of the CNN cameras. He looked only at Robert Marquez. When he resumed, his cadence was hauntingly rhythmic. He detailed the exact geography of his trauma. The drive from Columbus to Hamilton mathematically takes 1 hour and 47 minutes. On that terrifying night, gripped by the sheer panic of a son terrified he was about to lose his mother, he made the frantic drive in 1 hour and 22 minutes. He confessed, his voice thick with emotion, that he had no rational explanation for how he survived that speed, noting quietly that despite making the exact same journey many times since, he had never managed to replicate that desperate pace. Raising his head, his eyes sweeping across the tear-streaked faces in the audience, Vance clarified his intent. He wasn't sharing this intimate nightmare to paint himself as a unique victim. He was sharing it because he knew, in his bones, that it was a profoundly common American tragedy. He pointed out into the crowd, his voice rising with fierce solidarity, declaring that there were people sitting in those very folding chairs who had made their own version of that terrifying, high-speed drive in the dead of night. They may not have been racing from Columbus to Hamilton, he noted, naming local routes with intimate familiarity. Perhaps they were speeding from Visalia to Bakersfield, tearing down the highway from Lancaster to Mojave, or flying in a panic from Delano to Fresno. The geographical destinations changed, he stated with devastating empathy, but the sheer blinding terror of that drive remained exactly the same. Taking another deep breath to steady himself, Vance finally pivoted back to Newsom, his gaze locking onto the governor with the intensity of a predator who has finally cornered its prey. He addressed the Yale accusation directly, his tone hardening into cold steel. Yes, he went to Yale, but he brutally clarified exactly who financed that elite education. He paid for the first year with the blood-earned currency of the GI Bill, a benefit that exists solely because working-class Marines like him bleed in the dust of countries like Iraq. The second year was funded through scholarships he bled to earn. The third year was paid for by standing on his feet for 40 grueling hours a week, scrubbing dishes and serving food in the law school cafeteria, all while desperately trying to survive classes that Newsom himself had accurately recognized as the most academically punishing in the nation. For the very first time in the entire confrontation, Vance leveled a direct, unblinking stare squarely into Gavin Newsom's perfectly manicured face. The vice president's voice remained remarkably calm, yet every syllable was heavily laden with the crushing weight of undeniable, inherited privilege. With surgical precision, Vance laid out the governor's gilded autobiography, noting Newsom's comfortable education at Santa Clara University and Redwood Christian schools. He casually mentioned the governor's father, William Newsom, a powerful man who had been comfortably appointed as a federal appellate judge by Jerry Brown. Then, Vance twisted the knife, bringing up the Plump Jack Winery in the sun-drenched hills of Napa Valley, a lucrative family asset that had been conveniently sold to a young Gavin by his wealthy father when he was a mere 25 years old. The vice president's voice echoed through the hall, repeating the devastating fact that Newsom had been essentially handed a massive, profit-generating winery before his brain was fully developed. Vance paused, his posture utterly relaxed on the edge of the stage, explicitly stating that he was not launching a petty attack on the Newsom family's wealth, nor did he harbor any jealous resentment toward their financial success. He expressed genuine respect for hard work, but his eyes narrowing, Vance drove home his ultimate devastating point. He pointed out the sheer, suffocating hypocrisy of a man standing in a municipal convention center directly in front of an exhausted electrician like Mr. Marquez, directly in front of a struggling mother in row 8 whose daughter simply wanted an education, directly in front of the bruised and battered working heart of California, and daring to hurl accusations of performing a working-class identity. Vance's voice cracked like a whip across the room as he delivered his final verdict. Governor, I lived it. You inherited yours. With a subtle, dismissive wave of his hand, Vance suggested that Newsom should be the one to ask Mr. Marquez which of the two men standing before him truly understood the gritty reality of his life, though Vance added with a wry, knowing smile that he suspected Marquez was more than capable of answering that question for himself. The Bakersfield Convention Center did not erupt into chaotic cheers or thunderous applause. Instead, it experienced something far more profound, an emotional phenomenon nearly impossible for the frantic journalists to adequately describe in their subsequent print columns. The room simply absorbed the monumental weight of the truth. In row 8, the exhausted mother in the CAL FIRE uniform was quietly weeping, tears streaming unchecked down her face as her teenage daughter tightly gripped her hand. The sound of her sobbing was not loud or disruptive, but the highly sensitive C-SPAN audio engineer manning the soundboard in the truck outside would later isolate that specific frequency. In an internal network communication that would remain securely hidden from public view for 3 years, he would reveal that he clearly heard the weeping mother lean over and whisper to her daughter, her voice trembling with absolute conviction. He told the truth. Newsom, visibly shaken but desperately clinging to his political survival instincts, scrambled to find a counterattack. His face flushed, he stammered out a rapid pivot, aggressively declaring that the dueling biographical narratives were entirely irrelevant and demanding that the conversation return strictly to the cold, hard metrics of policy. Gesturing frantically, Newsom challenged Vance to explain what specific actions his administration had taken for Marquez, loudly accusing the federal government of brutally slashing crucial energy assistance to the state of California by a staggering 44% in a mere 9 months. Newsom's voice hit a shrill, desperate pitch as he accused Vance of trying to mask these devastating numerical cuts behind a smokescreen of performative, working-class authenticity, insisting loudly that the raw numbers simply did not care about Vance's sad stories. Up in Sacramento, the two anxious Democratic senators watching the feed exchanged another flurry of nervous texts, praising their governor for his relentless swinging aggression. But Vance refused to be rattled. He did not snap back immediately. Instead, he took his time. He slowly stood up from the lip of the stage, took 2 casual, pacing steps to his left, returned to his stool, and gently set the microphone down on the small table. He then walked straight to the very front edge of the stage, looming slightly over the aisle. When he addressed Newsom this time, he completely bypassed the electronic amplification. He projected his natural voice directly into the cavernous space, trusting the 1,962 architectural design, fully understanding that the raw human voice, stripped of technological enhancement, was the most powerful and intimate instrument in the room. Vance nodded in agreement, conceding that biography indeed was not policy, and calmly offered to obliterate Newsom on the policy front as well. With lethal professorial accuracy, Vance dismantled Newsom's primary attack vector, explaining that the loudly touted 44% cut to the federal low-income home energy assistance program, LIHEAP, was not a draconian elimination of funds, but rather a strategic, highly calculated reallocation. He patiently explained that those exact dollars had been forcefully redirected straight into the massive federal energy production initiative he had just detailed for Marquez. The net effect on the struggling households of California, Vance stated, projecting the data over a 5-year horizon, was a rigorously modeled 14% reduction in average annual electric bills, a statistic generated by the Department of Energy's own internal modeling systems. Smiling thinly, Vance offered to have his staff physically retrieve the printed models from his hotel room and deliver them directly to the governor's Sacramento office by Monday morning. He paused, his expression turning cold, and offered Newsom a stark choice. The governor could either continue standing in the aisle, screaming that Vance was a fake, while Marquez's bills continued to skyrocket and his beloved grandchildren packed their bags for Texas, or he could face reality. Turning his back on the governor, Vance casually returned to his wooden stool. He spoke directly to Newsom, but his voice was carefully calibrated to envelop the entire room. Assuming the role of a gracious but firm host, Vance pointed out that they had selfishly monopolized 15 minutes of the crowd's time engaging in political bloodsport. Gesturing to the exhausted faces around them, Vance reminded Newsom that Mr. Marquez, along with dozens of others, had been waiting with extraordinary patience. With a stroke of tactical genius, Vance laid a velvet trap. He proposed a compromise. He would continue answering the agonizing questions from the constituents, and the governor was more than welcome to stay. In fact, Vance generously offered Newsom the floor to interject whenever he possessed specific value-added data to contribute to a specific answer. But Vance finalized with a tone that brooked absolutely no argument. The evening belonged to the working people in the room, not to the egos of the politicians. Newsom froze, his eyes darting as he visibly processed the catastrophic dimensions of the trap laid before him. The snare was glaringly obvious. If he accepted the offer and sat down, he was publicly surrendering the entire framing and control of the event to his greatest political rival. If he arrogantly refused and stormed out, he would instantly broadcast to millions of voters that his fragile ego was vastly more important than the severe hardships of the citizens he governed. His perfect hair remained impeccably styled, but inside, his mind was frantically calculating the political math. He had to make a choice. Swallowing his pride, Newsom forced a tight, artificial smile and declared his willingness to participate in any dialogue that put the working people of California first. Vance didn't miss a beat. With a polite, almost devastatingly cheerful gesture, he directed the governor back to the empty folding chair in row 3, noting that Mr. Hernandez, the almond farmer, had politely shifted over to make room. The cameras, hungry for the visual humiliation, immediately swiveled to track Newsom's walk of defeat. The governor's own highly paid camera crew, who had spent the last hour desperately trying to capture heroic, low-angle shots of their boss bravely confronting the vice president in the aisle, were now forced to continuously film him awkwardly squirming in a cheap folding chair. He was trapped exactly like every other ordinary audience member, uncomfortably wedged between a rugged farmer from Shafter and an empty seat that had been abandoned 20 minutes earlier by a bored high school civics teacher from Tehachapi. With the governor effectively neutralized and sequestered in row 3, Vance seamlessly returned his attention to the desperate constituents. He called upon Maria Rodriguez, a 34-year-old single mother of 2 from Visalia, whose voice shook as she asked about the crushing cost of childcare and the labyrinthine rules of the federal child care tax credit. Vance's response was a masterclass in compassionate competence. He avoided bureaucratic jargon, detailing exactly how the credit had been significantly increased in the most recent budget reconciliation, explicitly stating the new effective dates, the precise eligibility thresholds, and the exact dollar amounts. As Mrs. Rodriguez, overwhelmed by the information, slowly sat down. Vance locked eyes with her and delivered a single, life-altering sentence. He explicitly confirmed that she unequivocally qualified under the new threshold, advising her that her tax preparer could verify the windfall in 15 minutes. Furthermore, he offered the full weight of his office, promising that if her preparer failed, his own staff would personally assist her, noting that the contact email was available at the exit. Overcome with relief, Mrs. Rodriguez simply sat frozen, silent tears spilling down her cheeks, while a complete stranger in the row behind her reached out and gently rested a comforting hand on her trembling shoulder. Vance then pivoted to Tom Beal, a 58-year-old retired Los Angeles Police Department officer whose brow was deeply furrowed with anxiety over pension protections, terrified by the looming shadow of the California Public Employees Retirement System's staggering $87 billion unfunded liability. Vance didn't offer empty platitudes. He unleashed a barrage of specific, actionable data. He detailed pending federal legislation, thoroughly explained a highly specific, obscure federal program designed exclusively for safety officer pension stabilization administered through the Department of Labor, provided the exact office name, the point of contact, the specific numerical section of the federal code, and the precise chronological timeline for the upcoming grant cycle. Mr. Beal, a hardened former cop who hadn't bothered to ask a politician a question in 11 cynical years, slowly sat down, his face a portrait of stunned respect, vibrating with the unique energy of a man who had finally received a concrete answer instead of a slick press release. The marathon continued as Vance engaged Amanda Reeves, a 46-year-old civics teacher from Ridgeview High School, in a deep 6-minute dialogue regarding federal civic education funding. He named the specific Department of Education line item he had personally lobbied to triple, genuinely asking about her curriculum and what her students were connecting with, concluding by deeply thanking her for her service. The bewildered sound engineer in the C-SPAN truck would later marvel that he had just recorded the longest, most authentic, unbroken conversation between a high-ranking federal official and a public school teacher in his 12 years on the job. The emotional climax arrived when J.D. Vance called on 22-year-old Jennifer Park, a recent CSU Fresno graduate drowning in $84,000 of student debt. Trembling in her college sweatshirt, she explained how her tuition inexplicably skyrocketed from $6,400 to $8,300 during her enrollment. Vance validated her panic, outlined her federal loan forgiveness options, and then deliberately turned his focus to Governor Gavin Newsom. Summarizing the brutal math, a staggering 30% tuition hike against a 19% inflation rate, Vance politely invited Newsom to answer her heartbreaking question. Trapped in a perfect political checkmate, Newsom stammered about complex funding challenges, prompting Vance to step back and suggest Jennifer ask the governor directly. Mustering her courage, Jennifer locked eyes with the governor and simply asked, "Why did tuition go up that much?" Newsom squirmed in his folding chair, offering sterile, bureaucratic excuses about difficult budget decisions. But Jennifer refused to let him pivot. She wielded the devastating story of her friend Marisol, who was forced to drop out due to the sudden rate hikes and was now trapped working at Target with $31,000 in debt and no degree. As Jennifer demanded to know why the governor broke her friend, a suffocating silence fell over the hall. It was a heavy silence owned entirely by a terrified student confronting a highly polished politician entirely incapable of giving her a straight answer. When Newsom patronizingly tried to spin the narrative one last time, Jennifer fiercely interrupted him, her voice breaking. Why did tuition go up? As the defeated governor slumped in his chair, Vance stepped forward from the shadows. Pulling a creased printed page from his back pocket, Vance revealed a highly confidential April 2023 memo from the CSU Chancellor's Office titled Tuition Increase Strategy 2023 to 2027. His voice dripping with icy contempt, Vance read the damning strategy aloud. The governor's office had advised that while 5% hikes would generate bad press, hiding the increases at 4% would silently compound revenue without causing any political damage to the governor. Staring directly into Newsom's soul, Vance translated the cold, bureaucratic jargon into human tragedy. He pointed out that while Marisol Hernandez didn't make the governor's carefully managed headlines, she was stuck working at Target, and Jennifer was standing right here demanding the truth. Newsom sat paralyzed and completely speechless. In the profound silence that followed, a teenager in the audience reached across the aisle to tightly grip Jennifer's trembling hand, a beautiful, desperate gesture of solidarity that the CNN pool camera instantly broadcast to the world. Gavin Newsom, the untouchable golden boy of the Democratic Party, was completely broken. Unable to answer two-year-old Jennifer Park's desperate question about her tuition, he stood up in agonizingly slow motion, whispered to an aide, and fled out the same side door he had triumphantly entered just 43 minutes earlier. The cameras didn't follow his retreat. Instead, they locked onto his empty folding chair in row 3, a silent, screaming monument to political cowardice. Meanwhile, J.D. Vance stayed. For another 40 minutes, he fielded complex, painful questions from a viticulturist, a Navy veteran, a convenience store owner, and a cattle rancher who declared him the first politician since 1976 to actually answer her. Wrapping up the night, Vance finally looked at Newsom's empty chair. Recalling his Marine drill instructor's lesson on remembering your true purpose under fire, Vance told the crowd, "I came because Mr. Marquez is a Christian." The governor only came because he had a question about me. By 11:47 p.m., the hall was a cavernous tomb of just 12 people, but the CNN pool camera was still quietly rolling. At the front of the room stood Vance and Robert Marquez, the 7-year-old electrician, whose frustration had ignited the entire night. Gripping his worn Union hat, Marquez made a stunning confession to the Republican vice president. He proudly recounted his family's 4-year history of voting strictly blue, but swore on his life he would never cast another vote for Gavin Newsom. "He came to my town tonight," Marquez whispered, his voice thick with betrayal. "He didn't see me. He saw a camera." Vance absorbed the devastating weight of the confession in complete, reverent silence. He simply thanked the man and wished his electric bill would drop. That unscripted 12-and-a-half-minute exchange became a digital nuclear bomb. By the end of the week, the raw footage had amassed an astonishing 231 million views. Marquez's agonizing realization birthed the global hashtag number "I came to listen," weaponized by the public against tone-deaf elites everywhere. Conversely, he saw a camera became the most lethal insult in American politics. Newsom's carefully crafted attack lines evaporated overnight, replaced entirely by the merciless loop of his cowardly exit. As Vance's social media exploded with 4.2 million new followers in a purely organic surge, the institutional shockwaves began to dismantle the California establishment. Terrified by the scrutiny, the California State University Board abruptly froze tuition and granted a full retroactive scholarship to Marisol, the friend Jennifer had mentioned, who was forced to drop out. The chancellor resigned in disgrace shortly after. Politically, Newsom was annihilated. The powerful IBEW union formally withdrew its decades-long endorsement, leaking a brutal letter stating, "Brother Marquez spoke for many of us." A catastrophic 1-4-point polling swing crowned Vance, the inevitable Republican nominee for 2028, while Newsom mercifully announced his retirement, his legacy reduced to a forced, frozen smile at his successor's inauguration. 4 years later, as Robert Marquez finally retired from the union, J.D. Vance sent a handwritten letter that now hangs permanently in the Bakersfield IBEW hall. It reads, "You voted for the other side your whole life. You still spoke the truth to me anyway. That's the America I serve." But as the shattered political establishment regroups and the chaos of the 2028 elections looms closer, a terrifying question remains. Will the old guard quietly accept this new American reality, or are they secretly engineering a devastating counteroffensive that will make the Bakersfield ambush look like mere child's play? The true battle for the nation's soul is just beginning. Stay tuned for the next explosive chapter.